Hello, everybody. I want to thank you so much for coming to our first lecture in our MOG lecture series this year. I'm Elisa von Jordan-Forgy, and I'm the director of the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, and I'm very happy to see such a really great crowd for our first lecture. So, and I think that speaks to, in fact, the subject matter being discussed today, which is very topical. It's very contemporary, right? It will address some of the issues that I'm sure you all have been thinking about in the last couple years. We are very, very lucky to have this year a postdoctoral fellow, Adara Goldberg. So I also want to take this opportunity to welcome her officially to our program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And I'm assuming many of you are taking classes now in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is how you found out about the lecture. That's great. So I'm going to ask my colleague Roz Siegel in the master's program as well to introduce Adara, because they are both hail from the Strassler Center at Clark University, which has, as many of you might know, the only PhD program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the United States. In the world as well, or like that specific type of program? In the world, right? So, great. So, please, Roz.
Thank you. So yeah, it's I'm Roz Siegel. I'm a assistant professor in Holocaust and Genocide Studies here at Stockton. It's my second year in the program, and it is really a particular pleasure to introduce you, Adara, to the lecture that will open the lecture series in Holocaust and Genocide Studies this year, because I don't know if you remember, but when I came to the Strassler Center, you were one of the first people that I spoke to. And you told me, you know, it's going to be terrible, but it'll be fine. You know, so, so I'm not going to, you know, not do this very briefly to leave you enough time to talk and for discussions. And the topic, I think, is very timely, right? These concepts, enemy aliens, refugees, probably the most relevant topic that we can think of today. So Adara has a PhD from the Strassler Center in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark, graduated in 2012, and published an award-winning book titled Holocaust Survivors in Canada, Exclusion, Inclusion, Transformation, 1947-1955, that came out in the University of Manitoba Press in 2015. And won the inaugural Marsid Foundation Prize at the 2016 Western Canada Jewish Book Award. She also published a number of articles and book chapters, and her current research now, if I'm not mistaken, you're exploring the post-war experiences of child survivors of genocide more broadly, and I think that we'll hear about this a bit now as well. As I said, I think a very relevant topic, and I think that's part of what we're doing in the program, right? Connecting these historical issues to the world around us, because this is really, it's historical issues, but it's also a history of the present in many ways. So join me in welcoming Dr. Adara Goldberg.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the introduction, Elisa, and especially to Roz. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today and to share a little bit of the work that I've done in the past, but I think more importantly for us to have a discussion about current issues surrounding refugees today. It's a long time ago. It's a minor story on the margin of war, on the margin of the Holocaust. It really shouldn't be mentioned, really not. It's a very distant periphery of the Holocaust. It is doing a disservice to the people who were murdered. Eric Koch, a prolific writer, veteran producer for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and university professor, offered this commentary on his wartime experiences in 2011. But Koch is not referring to a Nazi concentration camp. He's not referring to a ghetto in Europe. He's not referring to slave labor overseas. Rather, his testimony is referring to an incident that critically linked the fate of European Jews on both sides of the Atlantic. Born into a Jewish family in Frankfurt in 1919, he fled his hometown for England as a refugee in 1935. after completing a secondary education and beginning his university studies, he found himself entangled in a fraught web following the outbreak of the Second World War. He was at school one day when a number of officers came to tell him they needed to take him away for a little while to speak with him. They were going to bring him to the police station just to ask him a few questions. What ended up happening was he was arrested and interned. So fearful of infiltration once the war broke out, Great Britain rounded up enemy aliens, or any persons who was coming from an Axis nation, and concentrated a critical mass on the Isle of Man. Included in this wave of arrests were Koch and tens of thousands of German and Austrian Jewish refugees who had already found asylum once, who had already fled their homes to make their way to Great Britain. Britain, concerned about the possibility of enemy aliens attacking, turned to Canada and Australia to temporarily accept this group of foreign nationals through the duration of the war. And the Liberal government of Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King very reluctantly agreed. With little warning and no choice in the matter, 2,300 Jewish male refugees found themselves on ships destined for Canada. There they encountered a new type of persecution: internment in an allied nation. Today's talk will deal with this little-known story of persecution and survival in what's now considered a very dark page in Canadian and world history, and was little known about until recent years. It will also offer us the opportunity to reflect on the legacy of this internment today. I stumbled upon this internment experience accidentally. As Roz mentioned, my original work was dealing with Holocaust survivors in Canada after the war, and I was taking a look around and trying to find people to interview for my project. And an old friend of mine recommended I speak with her grandfather, a man named Rabbi Irwin Shield. I knew Shield's name. He was the leader of a major congregation in Toronto, where I'm from, but I was unaware that he was a Holocaust survivor. The thought had never crossed my mind. I never heard it mentioned anywhere. Didn't even know he was German. He's not a real survivor since he escaped Germany, my friend informed me, but he has a wide network of survivors for you to interview. I went into my meeting, very naive, not expecting much, but hoping that I might come out with some phone numbers of people to connect with. And I was pleasantly, although at the same time very unpleasantly, surprised at what I actually learned. I left Rabbi Shield's office armed with resources, including a handful of books he'd written about his wartime experiences, and at this time he was in his mid-80s already. He's still alive and he's 97 today. And also some of those phone numbers I was hoping for. But there was something more that he helped introduce me to. And I think what he did for me at the time was complicate my understanding of what a Holocaust survivor was. I was going into my research assuming that I was only speaking about people who survived the war in Europe. I wasn't aware that there had been internment in Canada. I think I interviewed him in 2008 for the first time. I didn't know about this. This wasn't something we were taught about in school books, and it certainly doesn't come up when you study the Holocaust in your textbooks. This really challenged, my understanding of these, this defining term, and expanded my horizon and scope for my own work. Shield was born into an observant family in 1920 in Mannheim, Germany, and he was arrested during the November pogrom along with his father. The two of them were interned initially in Buchenwald concentration camp. He was permitted release from the camp on the condition that he leave the country immediately. And the 19-year-old was able to acquire papers to go to Britain, along with his sister, who went as a housekeeper, as a maid. His brother was able to get out a little bit earlier and made his way to the United States. He was settled in Buffalo, New York. Less than 2 years after he fled to the UK, the former yeshiva student found himself behind barbed wire once again. Except this time it was not under Nazi rule, but at the Illinois camp in Quebec, under Canadian lock and key. In our initial meeting, Shield expressed mixed feelings about his experiences and the legacy of this internment in the wake of the final solution, what's known today. On the one hand, he was really grateful that he had survived, that he had the opportunity to come to a free country, or what would eventually be a free country for him, and he considered himself a Canadian patriot. But he simultaneously recognized that a real social injustice, a human rights violation, had occurred. But the bigger issue was, and this was not even 10 years ago, that for Shield and others, the trauma of internment fell a distant second to the suffering of those who came after. So, fell a distant second to the 6 million who were murdered, 6 million murdered Jews, including his parents and majority of his extended family, but also those who came to Canada after the war and who he deemed as having suffered far greater ills. It took decades before Shield was able to express to me that he had come to terms with the fact that he was a survivor. He was a different kind of survivor. It was a different experience, but his story was important nonetheless. Interesting to mention that my confusion or lack of awareness about the term survivor is not unique. And in fact, when I looked at the Fortunoff video archives at Yale University, they refused to include these narratives initially because they did not consider them Holocaust survivors, because these were people who lived out the war elsewhere. So I wasn't alone in this. But I think what this interview did for me was it raised a number of really important questions. Foremost among them, what was the story of internment? Who were these men? Why was so little known about them? And where did the story fit into our collective narrative of the Holocaust, of Canadian history, or World War II history? There was also another slew of questions that related more directly to my intended research. What happened to the men once they got to Canada? How did they negotiate residency status in a place that had no refugee policy to speak of and was a historically anti-Semitic nation? Were these men embraced by the local Jewish community? And how did they relate to those who came later? So the 35,000 Holocaust survivors and their families who came between 1947 and 55, who were predominantly of Hungarian and Polish origins. Again, as I said, today we're only going to begin to skim the surface. But in order for us to answer any of these questions, we need to really locate this narrative within two intertwined contexts. The first being Nazi persecution of Jews in Europe and the refugees' flight, and Canadian immigration policy in the 1930s and 40s. It's impossible to tell the story without that. So a briefer on anti-Semitism in Canada. Anti-Semitism was a socially accepted part of mainstream Canadian society well before Confederation, in the years leading up to World War II. Canada's roughly 160,000 Jews continued to face quotas on enrollments in educational institutes and restrictions on participation in various industries, including law and medicine. Prohibited access to vacation, destinations, and properties, Gentiles only, no Jews or dogs allowed signs were commonplace as well. Clergy, academics, and public figures fanned the flames of hate by espousing rhetoric in their religious communities and in the media. But despite the ubiquitous anti-Jewish prejudices and the nativist undercurrents that were plaguing interwar Canada, anti-Semitism rarely culminated in violence. The riot at Toronto's Christie Pits in August of 1933 constituted an infamous exception to this rule. Fighting broke out at a baseball game when youth members of a local swastika club, as they were called, unveiled a flag bearing a swastika at the game. The predominantly Jewish opposition team responded to the provocation, and the Italian Canadians stood alongside their Jewish neighbors. So they were all really immigrant communities together, primarily first-generation Canadians. Extreme acts of violence took to the streets and continued throughout the night. The miracle in this case is that nobody was killed. But what the riots served to do was stand as a warning. While Canadian Jews did not live under the oppression of Hitler's Germany, their presence and livelihood, as well as their power, their ability to help those brethren overseas trying to leave Europe, and to advocate for each other, stood under the shadow of anti-Semitism. This racist and nativist ideology, not dissimilar to things that we're seeing today, emboldened nationalist groups and these so-called swastika clubs. But it also influenced discriminatory immigration laws. Because there was no refugee policy to speak of, refugee applicants were categorized and evaluated by the same criteria as an economic immigrant. Jews were considered among the least desirable immigrants, regardless of their nationality. And to an overwhelming extent, Canadians supported government policy and widely opposed the loosening of these restrictions. There were two events that crystallized Canada's stance, their anti-refugee stance, the first being the Evian Conference in 1938 to discuss the rising mounting crisis of German and Austrian Jews. Fearful that Canadian participation would be misinterpreted as a willingness to accept refugees, the Prime Minister vehemently opposed attendance. And in a diary entry dated March 29, 1938, he explained his position in the following way. A very difficult question has presented itself in Roosevelt's attempt to different countries to unite with the United States in admitting Jews from Austria, Germany, etc. That means, in a word, admitting a number of Jews. My feeling is that nothing is to be gained by creating an internal problem in an effort to meet an international one. So far as Canada is concerned, with our great open spaces and small populations, we must nevertheless seek to keep this part of the continent free from unrest and from too great of an intermixture of foreign strains of blood. So these were the attitudes, really circling people when they ended up making their way to Canada. Mackenzie King agreed to send representation to the conference only once they were reassured that no country would be forced into action. And as we know, no country was. The second opportunity presented with the St. Louis Affair of 1939, after Cuban government officials refused entry to the group of primarily Jewish refugees. The ship's non-Jewish captain tried to steer towards the United States and unsuccessfully appealed to the U.S. to allow the refugees to land. The incident attracted international media attention, nowhere more so than in Canada, located right up the coast. Jewish and non-Jewish leadership pressured Canada's Liberal government to help the stranded refugees, all running low on food, water, and medical supplies. A telegram from Jewish leaders and non-Jewish intellectuals called on Mackenzie King to show true Christian charity and offer the homeless exiles sanctuary in Canada. By granting visas, Canada would have prevented the refugees from being sent back to Nazi-occupied territory. Once again, the Prime Minister expressed mixed emotions in response to this plea for asylum. He recorded deep empathy on the one hand, but he also noted this affair was much less our problem than the US and Cuba. And he assigned responsibility to his two trusted advisors, Frederick Blair and Ernest Lapointe. A blatantly anti-Semitic bureaucrat, Frederick Blair recognized all Jews, whether they were Canadian-born or foreign-born, as inassimilable, calculating, and opposed any considerations that were special or outside the realm for Jewish asylum seekers. He cited requests from family members and Jewish organizations as overly demanding, recorded no sympathy for any of these cases. He was also the one responsible for enforcing the special requirements, including required proof of $15,000 in capital for economic immigrants, which made the application process nearly impossible. Simply put, for him, the refugee problem belonged to the Jews and the Jews alone, and yet he would not allow the Jewish community to help. Justice Minister Ernest Lapointe shared Blair's outlook on the refugee crisis, and he stressed that Quebec, so French-speaking Quebec, was emphatically opposed to the liberalization of the immigration policy. And he suggested that any rash moves, namely the admission of Jewish refugees, would result in a severe dip in popular support for the Prime Minister. This is a problem for a consummate politician. In the end, Blair declared that since the ship's passengers did not meet immigration requirements, it could not enter Canada's territorial waters. No country could open its doors wide enough to take in the hundreds of thousands of Jewish people who want to leave Europe. The line must be drawn somewhere. For him, under his watch, Canada would not become Europe's dumping ground. And of course, Mackenzie King's intense efforts on maintaining popular support overshadowed any humanitarian sentiments he might have shown otherwise, and he never challenged this position. So as we can see, Canadian immigration policy and policymakers had a distinct anti-Jewish bias, and only 5,000 Jews entered Canada as refugees or immigrants, except for those from the United States or British nationals, between 1933 and 1948. Between 1933 and 1945, the number of those who came to Canada and were allowed to stay was closer to 2,500 people in total. The few who managed to successfully penetrate the Iron Gates were either the recipients of special orders, special ordering councils, or settled in Canada by chance. And the largest group among them were these 2,300 Jewish male refugees who came in 1940 as potentially dangerous enemy aliens. These were the exact terms. Doesn't really mean very much vis-a-vis Britain. Many of the men, like Shield, had recently spent time in Nazi concentration camps, and they'd been identified as potential fifth columnists by British intelligence. Doubly displaced, these men were first sent to Isle of Man and coming to Canada. Upon the ships being docked in Canada, the men were transported under military guard to internment camps in Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. The accidental immigrants, as they came to be known, were initially interned as prisoners of war in camps alongside genuine Nazis, Italian fascists, and real enemies of the state. Canada and the guards within them, these camps were guarded by former military officers, mostly retired, who held distinct anti-Jewish biases, as well as anti-German. And as the war diary on the screen attests to, there's a number of documents that speak to the fact that they understood these men were Jewish, but they were still German. And Canada was very anti-German at the time. And you can never trust them. It doesn't matter that they're refugees, they're prisoners of war, that's how they came to us, and that's how they'll be treated. This situation was loudly protested by Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals and leaders alike, including the head of the Canadian National Committee of Refugees and Victims of Persecution. This was a group convened at the League of Nations Canada by a non-Jewish senator named Corinne Wilson. It only took a few months before parliamentarians realized that the Jewish refugees were not threats to Canada or Britain, and as well were not safe living among Nazis. As a result, they agreed to establish separate camps for them. But the realization did not transform the refugees' legal status. Even once the men were no longer referred to as POWs, and they were now called refugees of Nazi oppression, complete freedom from barbed wire would take another 3 years to achieve. Now, life in the internment camps was difficult for the Jewish refugees, who ranged in age from age 16 years old to 60, and who represented a cross-section of Central and Western European Jewish society. They included everybody from yeshiva students to philosophers, from self-identifying Jews to converts with no connections to Jewish life previously. The internees were all identified, however, as Jews, as enemy aliens and potential security risks, and therefore had limited communication with the outside world. All of the able-bodied men were put to work at manual labor, as lumberjacks, in camp kitchens, or on the farm, for which they earned nominal wages. Fred Kaufman was a Viennese Jew who went to the UK at the age of 16 in the late 1930s. He ended up becoming a member of the Quebec Supreme Court, so a highly achieved man. And what he had to say about this experience was the following. The younger, more enlightened officers very quickly began to see the differences, but this was apparently a phenomenon that caused some difficulties in the very beginning. An officer who had been through the First World War, when a prisoner of war was a prisoner of war, the real enemy, you have to treat them decently, but that's as far as you go. But the refugee internees, not unreasonably, wanted different treatment. For instance, we said, Is there any reason we can't get a newspaper? Well, newspapers are forbidden for prisoners of war. But we're detainees. Well, as far as I'm concerned, you're a prisoner of war, and I'll treat you accordingly. I'll treat you correctly. So this was the popular attitude amongst those who were overseeing their charge. Dr. Walter Iggersheimer, another Viennese Jew, recalled that before the camps were separated, the Nazis would sing anti-Semitic songs, and then the Jews would respond back in German with their own songs, while Jack Kahn remembered the poor conditions in the Sherbrooke camp. As Eric Koch, the gentleman we met at the beginning, echoed about Sherbrooke camp, it was an old railway engine locomotive repair shop. If you want to repair a locomotive, you do it from the bottom. There were rails and there were ditches, and there was water in the ditches, and the windows were broken. It was getting cold. There were no mattresses, no sheets, no latrines. And for anyone who's ever spent a winter, as I have in Quebec, knows that this is not only a painful experience, but also quite dangerous. In June of 1941, the internee status was officially changed in law to refugees of Nazi oppression, and all of them were granted the opportunity to return to England to serve in the non-combat units. More than half of the group accepted this proposal. The others chose intern status until the opportunity they hoped would come up for them to remain in Canada permanently. Rabbi Shield offered the following rationale for staying in the camps rather than returning to a semblance of freedom in England. I was not inclined to re-enter a country that might still be invaded by Germany. Moreover, Canada was closer to the United States. If given a choice, most European Jews would have preferred to relocate in the New World, and that meant America. At the time, it would certainly have been my choice. Though immigration to the United States was ruled out for the time being, Canada was, at least, as close as I could get. Following their change in status, what the men discovered was that their situation became not only more tolerable, but also intellectually stimulating. Academics offered lectures, religious leaders led prayer services, and artists gave performances. Some men later recalled that the time in their camps was the most productive period of learning in their lives. This is where they studied English. This is where they became acquainted with Canadian culture and values. And through concerted efforts by the refugees themselves, who were really advocating quite loudly, and local Jewish organizations, youth studies had been disrupted by their displacement, received permission to sit the McGill University matriculation exams. These men, as a result, were able to apply for entrance into nearby universities. This was a real bonus. This was a way of getting out. But in the meantime, religious life really blossomed within these camps. Not only for those yeshiva students who had been studying the Torah and Jewish life before, but also the ones who were secular or did not identify with Judaism at all. In many ways, it was something to do. It was a way to occupy the time. After protests from Orthodox internees for the right to preserve Jewish tradition, kosher kitchens and designated prayer rooms were provided in one of the camps through the intervention of the Montreal Rabbinical Society. Rabbis and their students organized camp-wide services for holy days, observed the Sabbath and laws of kashrut, and made available prayer books and religious items such as menorahs at Hanukkah, phylacteries, and prayer shawls. So we now know the internee status was changed. So how do they get out? This became the new focus for the men in the camps and Canadian Jewry as a whole. Advocacy groups really turned their attention to how to secure the men's final release. The Canadian Central Committee for Refugees pressured the government to turn the internees over to the custody of Canadian citizens, industries, and institutions. Internees with first-degree relatives began to be released from the camps in late February of 1941. After this, the Minister of Immigration very begrudgingly began processing applications from would-be sponsors within the Jewish community, including business owners, farmers, and yeshivas. Loopholes in the immigration policy, coupled with immense pressures to sort of release the pressure. There's a war going on. We need these soldiers somewhere else, along with financial guarantees that none of these men would become charges on the system, signaled the internees' eventual release. And by the end of 1943, the internment camps for Jewish refugees closed, and 972 of these men were admitted into Canada. Although they were permitted to enroll in schools and enter the workforce, they were still not free. They were subject to travel restrictions, had to apply for permission to change jobs, and were required to report to the police regularly. Exiting camps is wonderful, but again, what do you do next? These are men who, for the most part, were really on their own. This proved traumatizing for many of the internees, refugees again. If youngsters went to school or yeshivas and they had a plan for their immediate future, older men who were released on work contracts, often granted by strangers and often only to appease the pleas of the refugee relief organizations, had seemingly little idea about what to do with their life outside of the camp. Munich native Michael Guggenheim was 36 when he left the camp in November of 1942, and he traveled to Montreal. He arrived with $80 that he had earned doing manual labor in the camp. He came with that and a small parcel of his belongings. When the men left the UK, they didn't have things with them. As I mentioned, they were really, Eric was picked up, at school. They didn't have personal items unless family was able to send it over in the days before communication was cut. An accounting firm in Montreal had arranged a contract on his behalf, but it was really a humanitarian gesture, as he had no training in accounting. He had been a lawyer. He turned to JIA, so the Jewish Immigrant Aid Services, and requested help in finding a better job, housing, and money to keep him afloat until he got things going. And the representative's response shocked him. As Guggenheim recalled 50 years later, well, you have $80. You don't need any help from us. You can manage yourself. Without the agency's support, Guggenheim rented a room in a boarding house and went to work, subsiding for the first couple of years on $50 a month during his first years in freedom. Other middle-aged refugees, like Julius Pfeiffer, a former Supreme Court judge from Dusseldorf, were released to relatives and employment sponsors. His release was arranged by a brother-in-law in Montreal, whom he lived with briefly. Although Pfeiffer, again, a former Supreme Court judge, wished to return to the legal profession, that was not an option in Canada. His credentials were not recognized, and he would have had to both learn English fluently and return to law school. This was too costly of an endeavor for him to take on at the time. So instead, he went to work as a chartered accountant. Pfeiffer was among the fortunate few among these men, in that his wife and sons, who had remained in Germany, they never made their way to Britain, all survived the Holocaust. And the family was able to reunite in Montreal in February of 1946. And so they rebuilt their lives together. But their reunification was the exception, not the rule, among the wartime refugees. Few of the internees lived to witness the return of surviving relatives. Few were still among the older refugees ever remarried or reestablished themselves in Canada with new families. Things were easier for the younger people, though, who transitioned into the care of Toronto and Montreal rabbinical schools or yeshivas. Erwin Shield was among the students released to the Toronto Torat Chaim Yeshiva, and he recalled being quite warmly welcomed by the head of the yeshiva, who he said was a surrogate father of sorts to the men, who took care of their room and board and permitted them to not only get rabbinical training, but to enroll in the University of Toronto, where he later earned a PhD. Other youthful refugees followed suit, acclimatizing to both the Canadian Jewish way of life and the professional playing field. But life in wartime Canada, remembering it's still a war happening, and these are still technically enemy aliens from Germany and Austria, they struggled to develop relationships within the Jewish community. Some newcomers felt the disconnect stemmed from the fact of Canadian Jewry's perception of these men as suspect. They came to Canada as suspicious persons. The question of how they got out of Europe when so many others did not. And also with the community's inability to acknowledge what had just happened in Canada, really an hour away from major Jewish communities. Others felt they faced discrimination as Germans, plain and simple. And as greenies, they were treated as ignorant newcomers in a foreign environment. That most of the yeshiva boys were well educated, from very refined, respectable families, that many of them spoke better English than Canadian Jews, whose native tongue was typically Yiddish, did, went unnoticed. This seemed like a sidebar. And so rather than forcing their way into the first generation Jewish community, what this particular group of refugees did was they found themselves situated among the uptowners, so the more established Canadian Jews. And as an aggregate, they found immense professional successes and employed really illustrious careers that were disproportionate to the rest of Canadian Jewish society. Among the 972 former internees who remained in Canada after the camps closed were rabbis, academics, politicians, musicians, and artists. Members of the group contributed greatly to the Canadian Jewish and secular society. They included a Nobel Prize winner, an Order of Canada recipient, a judge, a philosopher and rabbi, Emil Fackenheim. Many others, through their educational and cultural backgrounds, became respected leaders of the community, such as Rabbi Irwin Shields. They went from objects of curiosity into marriages with Canadian-born women, thus enlarging their kinship circles that had otherwise been slaughtered by the war. Sadly, though, only a few of these men ever lived to have their stories recorded or to have them discussed in public discourse or scholarship. All of this brings us back to Eric Koch's opening quote. If this is merely a story on the periphery of the Holocaust, why is it a story worth remembering? I suggest that the very reason the story is so noteworthy is because of its positioning on the edge of the Holocaust and Canadian and world history. Precisely because it's a story that sat largely ignored on the margins for decades, in many ways relegated to the sidelines, in the wake of the vastness of the Holocaust and the final solution as we know it today. These refugees turned internees were stripped of their freedom and autonomy, shipped to a foreign country as enemy aliens, and denied the rights and privileges of real prisoners of war by an allied nation. These men, among them teenagers, were left adrift to live amongst their perpetrators. Most, if not all, were denied information or access to news of their families overseas. But in addition to shedding light on this marginalized story about the Holocaust, the internment of Jewish refugees in Canada also speaks volumes about immigration and refugee policies of the 20th century. And it highlights the consequences of nativism superseding humanitarianism in the way that we respond to groups in crisis. It also provides a comparative framework for us to consider other incidences of wartime internment and detainment of both citizens of countries and foreign nationals, in the Canadian case, including the Japanese, Ukrainians, and Italians. But perhaps the timeliest lesson of this incident lays with its relevance today. A close reading of wartime internment and societal responses of advocacy and action encourages us to think critically about our own attitudes and ideas towards the other, to those deemed suspect by us today. As we face the largest humanitarian refugee crisis since the Second World War, I implore everyone to demonstrate a more humanitarian, compassionate, and sensitive response towards new refugees who are fleeing intolerable circumstances. They are not enemies, they are not aliens, rather they are asylum seekers who are worthy and deserving of respect, freedom, and human rights. Thank you. Okay.
This was a really terrific and provocative talk, and as a modern U.S. historian, it made me think about Japanese American internment in a different kind of way, which is where you started to go at the very end. And I was wondering if you had reflected more on that or know more about that. I hadn't really thought about internment during World War II from that global perspective. I wasn't aware of what Canada was doing, and it sheds for me a very different kind of light on Japanese American internment. I was wondering if there were conversations across the Americas about whom to intern, how these camps should operate, integration back into society afterwards. I was wondering about similarities in that way. And let me just apologize because I'm going to have to go after I hear the answer to this.
Oh,
but thank you so much.
My pleasure. Hopefully I can answer some of these questions. I think, yeah,
Do you wanna
I'll answer because you have to
Oh,
run
okay.
out. So
Yeah.
Do you want to take the mic though?
I don't need, I'm mic'd already. I'm good. I think the first thing is to work backwards, there were no plans for how to integrate people into society. That didn't exist. And that's actually the basis of sort of the critical mass of the work that I do is in responses to refugee waves after the war. And in the planning or lack thereof. In terms of conversations, the incident of the Jewish refugees coming in, there were conversations had with the British, so thinking on an international plane, with the British and the Australian. So they were discussing the plans and what was going to happen, but it seems as if the communication was fraught, and it was really quite ad hoc. Canada was pressured to take in these refugees. They did not want them. They were really not prepared. So these men you heard, they were at like an old locomotive, stationed in one case. They were at old army barracks that had been abandoned, after the First World War in another. So very little planning, went into this. And it's also a matter in the Canadian case of the location of these camps as opposed to the location of other camps. So for Japanese internment in Canada, you're speaking primarily about the West Coast, which is the same as the US. And I spent 4 years living in Vancouver. And so when I was there, I was speaking quite a bit with the Japanese community there at the Nikkei Center, who deal with issues of internment, and they were headed more into sort of the middle of the country. They were shoved as far away, from the water as they could be. And it seems that once the Jewish refugees were separated from the others, there was little to no mixing between anybody. So in many cases, as much as the Jewish refugees were kept detained, they were foreign nationals. The Japanese were Canadian. The Italians in Canada were Canadian. The Ukrainians were Canadian. So in that sense, if you want to speak about these injustices and how little is known about those cases still to this day, there's a lot of work that needs to be done because this was being done to citizens of the country in the name of safety and security.
I imagine that in Canada it was similar to the U.S. so that you had certainly you had Americans who were Japanese Americans who were imprisoned, but you also had immigrants as well. So there was I assume that there were multiple
It's the same, multiple generations, but in most of the
with
cases,
the immigrants, there are some similarities.
with the immigrants, there's some. But in the case of the Japanese, what's also interesting is Japanese Canadians who hadn't assumed citizenship, even if they'd been there for say 50, 60 years. So there's cases of elderly Japanese being deported to Japan. So they had a choice in some cases. They could return to Japan, but the question then becomes, what are they returning to? If they left 50, 60 years ago as children, which is when many of them came to build the railroads and to work in mining and fisheries. What are they going back to? But that was the option. It was that or this unknown internment away from their communities. And that, in the case of the Japanese in Canada, even amongst citizens, all property and rights were stripped and never returned.
And it
never
was
returned.
the same.
Yes. You're very welcome.
Hello. Thank you for coming out here to this seminar. My first question was more so in along of young lady over there about the Japanese internment relation almost to the U.S. to Canadian experience with the Jewish community. But why do you think, is my primary question, is history is almost blanked out in modern education about the Canadian internment camps?
I think, to put it simply, it's a blight on Canadian society and Canadian history. Canada was a member of the Allied nations. Canada was involved in the war from day one. As soon as the British entered the war, Canada entered the war. And to have this stain on their history, they're supposed to be this country fighting Nazism, and yet they're detaining individuals who could help them in the fight against Nazism. And so, in general, internment issues with the Second World War aren't taught very well, in Canada or the U.S. Very poor education. And I think what often happens is there'll be a paragraph about Japanese internment, a paragraph or two paragraphs, but it's embedded within the larger framework of the Second World War. And what happens in the high school education system, at least in Canada, I don't know in the States, but I imagine likely, is it just gets eaten up. It gets swallowed entirely. So there's so much pressure to cover a vast amount of material that these teeny tiny paragraphs, unless you have an educator that has awareness of the issue or has resources to teach it with, they won't do it. What I'm pleased about is I happened to work on this research when I was doing my doctorate, and I graduated in 2012. That summer, I ended up moving to Vancouver to work at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. And I like to think the reason I got the job there was they had just developed an exhibit about this topic that no one knew anything about. And they're interviewing me, and I know it all. So I was able to speak to it initially, but we created a virtual exhibit about this. In the Canadian case, it's bilingual. So it's now getting out there.
Just a caveat.
Of course.
So I had the distinct pleasure of being stationed in Germany for 4 years. I just got back last year in August. Going over there, we were not really forced, but it was encouraged to take a German history class before actually being living there permanently. It was almost a 3-week course, and they integrated almost, they wanted it to be known about the Holocaust situation and how it's a subjective matter to talk to locals about it, but it's almost as if like they owned up to it per se. Would you say that Canada would almost try to bring it to light more with more education to bring it be more important to the educational format, as though Germany's trying to do?
Yeah, I think it has been in recent years. And I think part of the reason, for instance, the exhibit that was created, which is a brilliant exhibit actually, was funded by the Ministry for Citizenship and Immigration. That's the reason it was able to be created. And that's the reason that many of these testimonies, they were able to compile them. So that came from federal funding. And so whether or not they're thrilled that this is being spoken about, it is known. For the first time within the last decade, there's now memorials up at some of the campsites. But I visited them when I was in New Brunswick a few years ago. And we went looking for it. And you can go to these old sites and you're searching for this plaque. And you're going, I know it's here. That stinky little museum, 5 miles away told me there was something. But even in that little museum, it neglected to mention who the refugees actually were. So there's still this idea that they were just refugees from Europe. They were enemy aliens. They're forgetting the fact that they were Jewish refugees. But there's also a second point, and I think it's worth mentioning that these men, by and large, did not speak about their experiences publicly because their experiences were really overshadowed by those of the survivors who came later and the stories of the families that had been lost that came later. And amongst the men I've spoken with over the years, they said we didn't want to put that out there. It seemed to pale in comparison to what others suffered. So it really remained sort of undercover. Families knew about it. But because they didn't see themselves necessarily as survivors, they weren't speaking as survivors the way that you might hear others. I hope that answers the question somewhat.
My wife mentioned that her father was one who had fled Austria, was from Vienna and fled Austria at 17, ended up in Britain, and then was similarly rounded up and put on a ship, but sent not to Canada, but to Australia. I'm wondering if you have any colleagues or other people who are doing similar projects with those who were interned in Australia in camps.
Yes, and I'm happy to connect you with them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Roz's father is still alive at 97, and when we went to Australia, we visited the second camp that he was at for a year and a half in Tatura, in Victoria. And it's just a crossroads now, but the museum there, which was originally the Museum of the Immigration Systems, is now the Museum of Immigration Systems and Internment Camp at Tatura. What did I say? Irrigation. They had an irrigation systems museum. And people who had remained in Australia after the war came to the people who had that museum and wanted to know where their history was. And when we visited there, we found the book with Roz's father's name in it in Camp 2, paintings by the internees, the detainees, music scores from the musicians who were there and who'd lobbied to get sheet music so they could. Before we went over there, we spent about a day and a half with Roz's father telling us these stories from 70 years ago. And one of the things we saw at that museum was a contemporaneous diary kept by someone in the camp that matched detail for detail what Roz's father had told us from memory.
They went to the Isle of Man, too.
Yeah, same story.
Same story.
I'd love to, if you have contacts for people who
Absolutely.
are studying that in Australia, we'd love to have that.
Absolutely. Hopefully
you.
they'll be able to help you out a little bit.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, I think it's your turn, Roz.
Yeah, any other questions? I just want to, I don't have, not any specific question, but I think that it's fascinating the way that this history, as you said, it's a stain, right, on Canadian history, and that's why it's not taught and not, but there's other elements in Canadian history that are also a stain on Canadian history that are not very well, that the society and the state are not very good at coming to terms with, right? Indigenous group, the violence and destruction of indigenous groups, and in general, what I really appreciated about your work is the way that it blurs how we tend to think about the Holocaust and this history in a good guys, bad guys kind of a framework, right? And it forces us, right, when we really treat it as a global history, not to minimize the horrors of Nazism and the Holocaust and World War II, but it forces us in this blurred framework to deal with our own histories as well, right? Because Jewish refugees is what turns the Holocaust really into global history in a very concrete way. And then we have internment of Jews in Canada that's tied to internment to other groups, Ukrainians and Italians, which is completely new to me. And then it ties to other layers of Canadian history, right? So we end up dealing with our own history. So the Holocaust is not just something that's distant in space and time, happened there, evil Nazis, it's kind of like a safe history, right? But it actually becomes a very unsafe history, right? That forces us to come back to our own societies, to our own places and times. So I think that's a really important move today when we think about this history. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. And looking forward to seeing everyone in our future lectures here.